Well, greetings everybody, and welcome once again to the Rec Poker Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Fredland, and today's topic will be part 4 of 5 of Jonathan Little's book, Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker, Volume 1. Today we're looking at Chapter 9, which is a long chapter talking about a number of miscellaneous topics. So it's a super interesting discussion, super interesting chapter. I really welcome you to check it out. And I think it's going to help your game quite a bit. Before then, just a few announcements. First of all, thank you to our sponsors, Running Aces, who is our official sponsor, Next Level Poker, who is our official tour, and they are led by World Series of Poker bracelet winner Chris Fox Wallace. Another partner of ours is the brand new Poker is Fun tour, led by Minnesota Poker Hall of Famer Mike Schneider. And Mike, congratulations on a successful first weekend. Sounded like it was a great time. Wasn't able to make it down to Canterbury, but it sounds like you were well supported and a really good kickoff weekend. And finally, pokercoaching.com, which is the training site for Jonathan Little. So thank you to Jonathan for supporting what we're doing as well. And I also want to thank those of you who have sent in some topic ideas. I've already started to get some audio responses from those that we're expecting to get regular content from going forward, including Jonathan Little, Fox Wallace, Mike Schneider, Ku Vang, Aaron Johnson, Vlad Revniaga, and more folks like that. So it's going to be a good time. I think you're really going to enjoy the new format once we get past the book discussion as well. Quick shout out, All In for Africa, October 28th, 10 o'clock. It's not at 10:30. It's going to be at 10 o'clock, their regular Saturday morning tournament time at Running Aces. The final table is going to be broadcast by Next Level Poker, so that's super exciting. And one change or one thing that we're still thinking about is, I mentioned last time we have this amazing Hawaiian vacation that's been donated. We're still trying to figure out how to incorporate that. So that may be part of the All In for Africa tournament, but we are looking at potentially moving it to a separate tournament altogether, maybe doing some kind of a winner-take-all $100 buy-in or something like that for that trip. So we're really looking at how do we maximize the impact from that donation. We're still playing with that, but even if that's not part of it, what we always have is 45 to 50 regular bounties scheduled, a ton of money that's available in bounties. It usually ends up being an overlay when you look at the buy-in, and then you look at, we take a percentage for charity, and then the rest goes out in the cash prize pool, and then we add the bounties on it. It ends up being an overlay almost every time. So I would love to have you come out October 28th, 10 o'clock, support what we're doing there. The flyer is almost done. We're trying to finalize what we're going to do with that big prize before we put the flyer out there. But it's looking pretty good. So I'd love to have you all out there. As far as the episode today, we'll do a quick commercial thanking our sponsor. We'll hear some audio submitted by Jonathan Little, and then we'll continue the conversation. We got a few different people involved in this conversation because we couldn't complete the conversation in one sitting. So you're going to hear from a few folks, including John Somsky and Andy Kaplan, who both just finaled the Sunday event of the first weekend of the Poker is Fun tour. So that's kind of exciting and good timing for that. So with that, let's continue on with the show. Feel free to reach out with any suggestions, and we will chat with you later. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker.
Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little. I'm here with another part of this book club for the Rec Poker podcast. I hope you're enjoying going through Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker. Today we're going to talk about miscellaneous topics when you are playing very deep stacked. So when you are playing deep stacked, I think there's a lot of value, especially when you're learning the game, in keeping your decisions simple. This is a topic that comes up a lot when you're talking to high-stakes players. They're always trying to figure out, should they make the play that makes the most money or the play that leads them to make the fewest mistakes? And this often comes up, for example, on the river when you're trying to determine if you should make a somewhat thin value bet or if you can just easily check call with a hand like top pair, middle kicker. And when you're trying to eke out the tiniest of edges in tournaments or in cash games, often you want to make the difficult play. But if you are not a world-class player or prone to errors, maybe you do want to lead or make the play that leads to simple decisions, which may often be checking with hands like top pair marginal kicker on the river with the intention of just easily check calling. There are a few other situations where this manifests itself, but you can read about those in the book. You also want to know what you are inducing if you do make a specific play. So imagine on the river, you decide to bet small. Let's say the pot's 20 big blinds and you decide to bet 3 big blinds with top pair. You should have a very clear idea of what you're going to do if your opponent raises. Versus some players, they are never going to raise unless they have a good hand. So if they raise, you can easily fold. Other players will see that small 3 big blind bet and think, you must be weak because why else would you make this tiny bet? And they will raise virtually every time. And against those players, you have an incredibly easy call. So you always want to be aware of what you are inducing. And if you're not aware of what you're inducing because you think your opponent plays well, you should not make a play that may induce your opponent to necessarily do one thing or the other. Something that plagues a lot of players, especially in the $500 to $1,000 buy-in range, is fancy play syndrome. They see players on TV making extravagant plays, which really happens, one every 500 hands or something, and they think that that's just normal poker, and that leads to these players playing absolutely crazy. Either not necessarily crazy, but not optimally at all. They'll do stuff like slow play a strong hand into the ground, thinking that they're trapping their opponents, or they'll run these elaborate bluffs. And, they fail a decent amount of the time because bluffs do inherently fail sometimes. And I strongly suggest you just play a good, fundamentally sound strategy with the capability of getting out of line sometimes. Do not think that you must be making fancy plays every time, or don't think that you have to try to win every single pot you enter. It is okay to lose pots in poker. That is part of the game. And if you try to get too fancy, you're just going to burn money. And this is why a lot of the players in the mid-stakes games never make it to the high-stakes games. They are much too concerned with stroking their egos and trying to show the world how good they are than they're actually concerned with making money in the long run. When you are value betting, you usually want to make a point of giving the illusion of fold equity. So say you do have the nuts, and you bet the flop and the turn, and you're on the river, and you're against someone who's generally aggressive, and you decide you want to bet. You want to make sure you bet an amount that allows your opponent room to raise. And this also applies on the flop and on the turn. I guess let's talk about a flop situation. Say you have a 15 big blind stack. You make a min raise, someone calls, flop comes, whatever. You have a really good hand that you're not planning to fold. The pot's going to be about 5 big blinds in this spot with about 13 big blinds left. If you bet something like 9 big blinds on the flop, just some huge bet, well, your opponent knows you're never folding, right? So if your opponent knows you're never folding, that's a problem, especially when you're trying to extract value because your opponent's never going to bluff you. Instead, if you bet 1.5 big blinds, some small bet, versus an aggressive player, you first off may know what you're inducing. You're either inducing them to call or raise, both of which you're fine with because you have a really good hand. And also, you give them plenty of room to make a bluff. So always make sure you give your opponent plenty of room to make mistakes. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you always want to make a point to play a little bit more straightforwardly in multi-way pots, but you also want to make sure you play somewhat straightforwardly in large pots. And that's typically because large pots are typically played with strong hands, unless your opponent's crazy again. But if you're playing a large pot and you don't have a very good hand, that could be an issue. You either messed up somewhere earlier in the hand that led to this large pot, or you are just against a strong range. And if you're against a strong range, you probably want to figure out a way to get out of the pot if you don't have a very good hand. Something that comes up in small stakes a lot that doesn't really come up in high stakes tournaments very often is when you are raised or re-raised for the minimum. So say on the flop, you bet 3 big blinds and your opponent makes it 6. This is a tough spot where usually you are trying to take advantage of whatever you think about your opponent's tendencies. So some players will always check min raise when they have top pair, top kicker, or better. Against those players, you often have a very easy decision because you realize the pot odds you're getting. Often you need to win about 20% of the time based on the pot odds. If your hand will win 20% of the time or more, you should call, and if you won't, you should fold. Pretty easy. It gets more difficult when your opponent's range gets wider when they're check raising with stuff like draws and also top pair, top kicker, because now if you have a hand like middle pair, you can't really justify folding, and you're in a pretty tough spot. But when you do get raised the minimum, always understand that you are trying to exploit each specific opponent. Some players will make these re-raises only with good hands. Some people do it with a much wider range, and you have to act accordingly. We also discussed in this section how to play when there's a maniac on your left. This is a scenario that's very, very difficult for a lot of amateurs because they do not properly adjust. You have to understand that when there's a player on your left who is incredibly aggressive, that player is going to raise and re-raise when you put money in the pot. So what do? You first off, let that player know that you are capable of playing only or more than only the nuts, right? You don't want that opponent to just think that you're only playing premium hands. And then you tighten up a little bit. So you can play a somewhat normal strategy at the beginning of the day. This player will probably raise and re-raise you a little bit, and you'll end up folding some. But then you just tighten up a little bit. I'm not going to say tighten up a ton, but tighten up a little bit and play in a manner that gives your opponent plenty of room to make bluffs. You want to do a lot of checking and a lot of calling versus maniacs because they are going to view your checks as weakness. Whereas in reality, if you're just checking all of your hands, that does not indicate strength or weakness. And if you tailor your ranges appropriately, you will have enough value hands in your range to just very easily check call down. And when you do have a hand like middle pair versus a maniac, if you think they are trying to bluff you, just sit back and wait for these middle pairs and better and check call, check call, check call. And you're going to end up winning the pot something like 60% of the time. Now that implies you're going to lose 40% of the time, but that's okay because if you're investing decent amounts of money with 60% equity on average, you are going to crush your opponents in the long run. And finally, this section, we discuss how to be the table bully. And this comes up occasionally in games where everyone's just incredibly passive, but I'm not really finding these tables exist so much anymore, at least in the high-stakes games. Most of the time now, players understand that they just can't let you run them over. So if you do find yourself at a table where your opponents are just playing very tightly, very straightforwardly, and just not doing anything out of line at all, you really should open up your game quite a bit. But at the same time, realize that if these players are playing back at you, they're probably not fed up at you if they are just weak, tight, passive players. They just have a good hand. And when someone has a good hand, you have to be disciplined and get out of the way. So that's going to be it for today. I want to thank all of you for being here on the Rec Poker Podcast. Hope you enjoyed going through this part of the book, and I will talk to you next time.
Well, for me, the one of the lines from Chapter 9 was make your decisions simple. And I think it's a theme throughout his book. It's about putting pressure on your opponents so they fold and to give you information about what they're going to do in the hand, or making your bet sizing such that you have an easy decision if someone pushes over the top of you, either an easy push call or an easy fold. And I think that's something I don't necessarily think a couple steps ahead in order to make my decisions simple. And I often give myself harder decisions than are necessary.
Yeah, and one of the questions I had on that is, by thinking ahead, you know what you're going to do, so your decisions are simple in that way, but the decisions are still decisions you have to make. It just seems like you're changing the timing of them, either making them earlier or later.
Well, I think it's also thinking about taking in the consequences of your actions. Often, I have a standard bet size, and you realize all of a sudden that bet size, if someone pushes over the top of you, makes the odds that you're getting for the call a really difficult line to decide on. Are you going to be making, because depending upon where you put their range, you're kind of exactly on the decision line. Whereas if you bet a little smaller, maybe you can easily fold, or if you bet a little bigger, then you're definitely getting the right price to call. So, it's those types of things, thinking ahead to not put yourself into difficult situations.
I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah, so it's either, I know I'm going to bet here and thinking ahead what the consequences are, so what's my bet size so that I can either fold or I want to commit myself so I get it all in. And I suppose the same thing is true thinking through how many big blinds you have and what if I'm going to fire all three streets versus kind of pot control, or at least, putting yourself in a situation where you're not making a decision for your entire tournament.
Right. Or, it might be as simple as deciding to check a river back rather than trying to get some value, because it'd be really ugly if they pushed over the top of you.
Right.
That's making your decision simple.
Oh, okay, that's good. Is it something that So when you read that, was it something that just resonated with you? Like that's something that you pay attention to that other recs should, or it's something that you're thinking,
It's
boy, I
something
need to improve on this.
it's something I know I should pay attention to, but I don't. I put myself into difficult situations, and partially, I've always thought that, well, a good poker player should be able to um, handle and make the right decision when in difficult situations. But I think an even better poker player makes it such that they don't have to make difficult decisions as often as possible.
I think that's good, man. I think that's really good because it does appear to me that when I play with some really really top players, it just seems like they're never frazzled, and of course part of that is their experience, but part of that is it does seem like they're never really put to the test.
Right. I mean, that's part of the, you see the really good aggressive players, they're constantly min betting. And it seems like whenever you get a hand, they're always getting away from it. Well, that's because they've done the calculations and they know they can bet and get away from it, and it's an easy decision for them to fold. So, it's something that a lot of really good players have a good handle on.
That's good. How about you other guys? Is that something that resonates with you, or do you have other examples of maybe how we make the game more simple?
Well, I think one of the things I've noticed, one of the things I've noticed throughout the whole book, and it kind of was like a revelation today as I was prepping for this and reading a little bit more. It's always about knowing your opponent, because he gives you all of these different things that you can do, these different plays that you can make, these different ways you can be, but then he always kind of tells you that, well, it's based on your opponent. So you really need to understand your opponents to be able to make your decisions easy. I think in that chapter even he talks about if your opponents to the right are raising constantly, you play tighter. If your opponents to the left are constantly folding their blinds, you play looser. It's always based on the opponent. So the main takeaway I got was, hey, I better pay more attention to what my opponents are doing.
Yeah, and I could chime in too. I mean, I believe the first person was John. I think you summarized that really well, and I think it's in a later chapter, but he talks about the Swedish friend somewhere in there that says like he always bets a high enough amount where if the other guy goes all in, now I have to call. So I've made my decision by making my bet already, and so depending what the guy does, I just call or not. Like I think it's interesting to be. And I think it didn't sound like he immediately agreed with that logic, but it's an interesting kind of way to go about it where you are putting the decision on other people, and depending on what they do, yours is already made for you. And I think that's a bit about John. I think what you were sort of describing that inside of, knowing your person well, which is, or the opponent well, is obviously extremely important to be able to get this right. And everyone's going to make mistakes with this, but, just making your moves, whether it's a smaller bet or a larger bet, so it's easy for you to decide if I should get away or now I have to call by the pot odds. Your decisions on earlier streets are compounded, and everyone knows this in poker, so much more greatly by the time you get to the river. And so thinking about that so many streets earlier and the action that you're taking and knowing that it's going to compound itself later, I think it's just one of a larger takeaway from this book and from Jonathan in general and a lot of the other things that he writes. It's the mindset that I think a professional poker player has developed, and it's kind of second nature to them at that point. And I think he's trying to impart that through this book. So I completely agree with everything that you laid out. So, John.
This is Andy. The one thing I would say too is, when he talks about making your decisions simple, early on in that chapter, he talks about, a 40 big blind stack, and you raise and your opponent re-raises. This is after the flop, and you flopped a flush draw, right? So you have ace king of clubs and two clubs come on the flush. He's talking about, 3-betting all in there. And at first when I read that, I was like, if someone's raising you, they're showing strength, but that type of a decision, it makes sense when you think about it, because now you're putting a lot of pressure on your opponent, and it's really a simple decision for you. You're like, okay, I've got the flush draw. I'm going to put pressure on your opponent. And it just seems like making a simple decision like that long term is good because now you're putting all the pressure on your opponent as opposed to trying to play with what is in essence a draw for 2 more streets. It just that simple decision seems like it does make sense when you think about, well, now I'm putting all the pressure on my opponent.
Well, and to back you up on that, I think too, if he's playing that ace king suited in that spot or whatever and flops the flush draw, like he knows going into that hand, I'm calling this to literally, I mean, obviously everyone wants to flop the nuts there, but he's going into it with like, if I can flop a 4 flush here, I'm stacking right now. Like I've already made that decision again where it's easy. I've got 2 overs of the board, likely 2 overs or whatever my opponent has, and 9 extra outs for the flush. Like I'm getting it in, good fist pump, get it in. And that's like I think I agree with you where like sometimes someone will all raise and they jam and like, should I go with this? I got ace high, where it's, I believe, what he's trying to teach people is like, you should be like, yes, that's exactly what I wanted to happen. I'll take my 45+% draw or percent equity there. So.
No, I think that's good. I think yeah, because I mean, fold equity we all know is a huge thing too. But yeah, what's the mental energy that's expended, in those situations and over the course of especially a multi-day tournament? How much of those sort of things add up? Where you're the one that's always making the tough decision, and part of that is maybe avoidable things like stuff that you guys already mentioned. The bet sizing and making those decisions on flush draws. But I think even the things that are even more basic, like if I open with a raise pre-flop and then somebody re-raises me, I'll do this, and other people too. You kind of go into this agony, sort of painful. I've got pocket 6s, and I opened, and somebody in position re-raised me, and what do I do? And that sort of thing. So those things I think really add up the emotional drain versus sort of knowing when I open with 6s, I'm either going to fold, call, or re-raise to a 3-bet, depending, like Rob said, on the player that I'm up against. And so I still have a decision to make, but I've kind of already pre-made that decision when I opened with 6s or I opened with aces or ace queen or whatever the situation might be.
I think that's totally fair. And Steve, I think the part that sometimes if you're going to bring it back to more rec player instead of like a Jonathan Little is, maybe like Taylor, who was playing online a lot from our group from previous episodes, maybe that he's getting to get in 10, 15, some volume, every single day and stuff playing online. But for most of us, I'm at least speaking for myself, I think, to get up and get to play, I've got to take, a half day off from work and work out things with the family, things like that. And that like comes to mind when you're there at the game playing and all of a sudden that ace king suited 4 flush, I know that I should fist pump, get that in. But then another part of me is like, it's taken me a lot of work to get up here and play. And I've got chips. Like I'd be okay if I laid this down. I'll be just fine. But I think it's an important part to sort of think of what Jonathan's trying to tell you is whether you play once a month or you play every single day for larger stakes. Like that's what you're kind of trying to be, where those types of moves are automatic. And I think that, that's kind of part of what he's trying to impart to even, I know the book's that, sort of geared towards professional poker players, but I think we can all learn a lot from that. That's like, again, that is a let's just get it in and see what happens. And if you don't win, that stinks. And it stings for some of us a little bit more in that scenario, but it's still the right play. So
I think it's a really good point. I think it comes back, and we're getting off the question with I'm taking us to a different road, but like I think it comes back to, in a sense, the vision or the purpose for why each of us play. And like you said, if you're playing every single day, you can make those decisions, you can take those chances, and there's a tournament tomorrow. And you're really trying to maximize your ROI, and it's the right decision because in the long run that's going to get you further ahead. But if you're playing poker recreational because I just enjoy the game, I want to spend a few hours at the casino, meet a few people, have a few laughs, have a few beers, whatever it is, it does change how you play. Especially if you, like you said, you're only going to be back there in 30 days. Well, I don't want to bust out the first hand after the rebuy period. I want to play for a while. And so it does come into play, and it's exploitable by the better players, but it does come back to the reason why you're there. And I think we make decisions based on that. And for some people it's I just want to cash. That's sort of my goal. And so they play like they're going to cash. Some people, I'm just going to have fun. So they play like they're going to have fun. Some people are, I don't care how crazy I am. I just want to put a bad beat on somebody. And so they play like that. And so I think that's an interesting dynamic. And maybe, I don't know, maybe some of you guys talk about this. Like when you talk about knowing your opponent, maybe that's something to consider is what do we think that the purpose of that person playing is, or why are they playing? And maybe that's a good insight to have on people.
That's a great point, Steve. What's their intention? Because yours might be, like you said, I want to play for a long time today. I don't get to play that often. Well, that's probably not a mindset of a person that's trying to win. I mean, you might win, but you also very likely might min cash with that that mindset. If, like you said, if you're just trying to lay a bad beat on someone, you're probably going to chase some weird draws and be ready to rebuy. But I think to your point, the people that play every single day, they're strictly making the most positive plus EV kind of choice all the way, and that it's tough to play that way again if you are just a rec. I shouldn't say just if you are a rec player, it can be difficult to think that way. But inverse flipping that to your opponents and thinking about and trying to sort of put them on, from their image and all the things you're taking, and what's their intention today? Are they here to win the tournament, or are they here to have some fun, or whatnot? I think it's a really great point, Stephen. Something really interesting to kind of consider while you're sitting there at the table, beyond just, I think he's loose or he's there, figuring out what is their intention here today. It probably leads to some pretty interesting insights on some of their bigger moves and why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I think everyone looks at trying to get the best value out of their tournament. And if we're talking about from a money point of view, that would map directly to ROI. But some people look at it like, well, how much am I paying an hour to play? If I can get 3 hours of play out of this $50 tournament, that's a good investment for me. Doesn't matter whether they cash or not. They just want to get their 3 hours in, which means they aren't necessarily willing to take the risks that are necessary in order for them to win the tournament. Other people have different motivations. I was in the Omaha tournament I played recently. One of the guys needed one more final table to get to the Running Aces Player of the Week or Player of the Month or something like that. So in that spot, I knew that I'd be able to put pressure on him if the situation ever came up, because he wouldn't want to go out before the final table came together. So, you do have to know what your opponent's motivations are and try to figure that out. Some people want to make the final table, like you said. Some people want to cash, whatever that might be.
This is Andy. I was just going to say, I agree with that. And I think it's interesting because sometimes you have that attitude of, am I just trying to get to the final table or just to cash? But specifically to Little in his book, I mean, in the beginning of his book, if I remember correctly, he's talking about, hey, this book is not about, he criticizes those people that make it to the final table and don't have a big stack. And I think his idea is, I want you to get to the final table with a big stack and to win the tournament. So I get that. And I agree with the fact of, like, sometimes you're like, hey, I just want to play for a couple hours. But specifically for Little, he's talking, and I think some of the things he's talking about, especially the aggressive things he's talking about, hey, you're playing to win, or you're gonna maybe bust out early.
Right, and I've talked about this on the previous podcast too. That was one of my transformations, and maybe gone too far. But I used to be much more concerned about trying to get in the money, and calling that a win. And what I found out was, I got in the money, a really high percentage of the time, but my multiple, when I did cash, like my multiple of what I got back relative to what I paid in was like less than 3. You know what I mean? So like it was a $50 tournament. My average cash was less than $150. Well, even if I cashed 25% of the time, I'm a losing player. And so I made an intentional effort to increase that multiple. So now my cashing percentage has gone down, but my multiple is now like 9. So I don't cash nearly as much, but when I do cash, it's more of those top 3 spots. And I do think that's what Jonathan's referring to is, all the money's in the top 3 spots, and it means you're going to bust tournaments early. It means you're going to look like a fool, playing more aggressively in some of those spots. But I think it's exactly what his point is. But there again, that's the goal. There is to maximize ROI. And Jonathan, and I have the luxury of playing more than most recreational players too. And if I knew I wasn't going to be able to play in the next few days, I'd look at some of those decisions and say, well, that sucks. It's going to be another month before I get to play, and I only played for 45 minutes.
I think, though, Steve, what you're saying is, I mean, it kind of to sum that up a little, if I could, I think you have to embrace variance in that spot, and I couldn't. My natural self is anti that as hardcore as you could be. I'm trying to find all these spots that are the least variance possible. But I think for a guy like Jonathan Little, or even just someone that plays as frequently as he does, even if you're not playing 1,500, 3,500, the level of events he's playing, I think at that, when you're playing with that sort of level of frequency, you have to embrace frequency, and you have to just take those spots and take your wounds and come back, But that's hard. It is. I really think it's really, really hard when you don't get to get out much. It becomes so much easier to go, I'll just fold right now. I'm probably ahead, or, I've got a great draw here, but if I don't hit, I'm gone. I don't really want to drive home now, And that's to your point, Steve, I think that's an interesting kind of thing to think about when you're ranging an opponent. Put that into the mix, not just your physical kind of initial read of them. Are they old? Are they young? Are they this? So that, all the kind of things that people sort of do as a very first gut reaction. But watch them play a little bit, and I don't know that I've spent a lot of time kind of thinking that way. What is their intention today? I think it's a great question to ask yourself.
Well, and they'll tell you. I mean, I know I probably do too, but if you just kind of start chatting with them, they'll basically tell you what they're trying to do. If you know it's somebody who plays quite a bit, you can just ask them, hey, how you doing in the points race? To John's point, they'll tell you, oh, I need one more final table, that kind of thing. Or, oh, yeah, I haven't been able to get out for the last few months, or, whatever it might be, or I'm here for the whole weekend. And, yeah, I think eventually they'll kind of tell you. And, yeah, it is interesting because I always think about, kind of to Rob's point, knowing your opponent, so you say, okay, what is their player type? And that's important. But, yeah, this kind of motivation behind that is an interesting insight, yeah.
So, I can't remember so my point was that just when you're playing just to go the next step, I think that he would argue that that's not the right way to play. You've got to have the mindset of, you got to play to win. That was kind of my point that I was going to make.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's a hard pill to swallow sometimes. I think a lot of times we have kind of the scratch off lottery ticket mentality where, anytime we get money back, we feel like we're a winner, and so we might go into the store with $10 and come out with $3, but we feel like we're a winner because we scratched 4 winners in the process of doing that. And I think at the end of the day, I was just going to say quickly that, I think that, to me, that's the beauty of tracking your results. And I know there's a lot of recreational players out there that are probably rolling their eyes at that. And I know I'm more of an analytical person, but I think there's so much power in tracking your results. And then, if you're able to do a little analysis on it, that's great. Otherwise, find somebody that can. But I think there just has to be a lot of players out there that think they're winning players because they say, boy, I'm cashing 15% of the time, which is well above average. But I think if they look at their ROI and all of the min cashes that are involved, they might be a losing player. And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't play because, they're having a lot of fun doing it. But it maybe would open up their eyes to see where they maybe are missing some value by playing more conservative in some of those spots where they maybe should err on the side of aggression.
Yeah, and I'm certainly one that, when I play, many times I'm like, okay, I just want to reach the final table, or, you want to, I get it as a rec player. You just sometimes want to just enjoy yourself and have fun. But I think when you're reading, specifically this book, Jonathan Little, he's I think his theory is you got to play to win, and you got to make those aggressive plays that are going to get you the chips to win the tournament and take that, slightly higher variance route as opposed to just, limping your way to the final table.
I'd love to hear from Rob. I know, my take on you, Rob, we've had a chance to play together a bit for the last couple of years, is that you're a guy who who doesn't shy away from the big spots, that you go for the win. And I'm curious if my perception is right, and is that something that you had to work on, or has that always been part of your personality?
No, I think that's something I had to work on. I had to. Well, let's see, at the beginning when I first started playing live poker, I would be really pissed off when somebody called my all in with a hand that was worse than mine and then suck out on me. So it was like I'd be mad, and I'm going, well. Then after a while, I realized, well, what did you want him to do, right? You wanted him to call you with that hand. So I started taking the fact that there could be a bad beat in my future. I took that for granted, and I took it with a grain of salt. I mean, it's going to happen. It's bound to happen. So you can't be afraid of it. And I think that's what you mean about me is I'm not afraid to get my money in good, even though it's my tournament life. So I'm willing to do that, and most of the time, I can honestly say most of the time when I go out of a tournament, whether it's one of these leagues that I'm in or running aces or down at Canterbury, I usually go out with the best hands going in. So it's but I agree with what Derek and Andy were saying, that it does get tough because I don't get out as much to play poker as I'd like. And so, you get into a spot early on, say you're there for an hour. I remember going down to Canterbury and playing the Wednesday 235, and I busted out in the second level. And it was like, I drove an hour down to Canterbury, played for a half an hour, and went home.
Yep.
But what do you do?
Well, there's short-term variance and there's long-term variance, and you hope that eventually you develop the skill edge to give you a positive ROI. But, I've had a nice run lately where I've had some positive variance and some good things happen. But right before that, I went 18 consecutive tournaments without cashing. And
Right.
And I think about, the frequency with which I get to play means that, it was 4 to 6 weeks or so. And I count every rebuy as an entry and all that stuff too. But so I went 4 to 6 weeks or whatever it was without cashing, and that was really hard for me. But it was only 4 to 6 weeks. If you're playing twice a month and you go 18 straight, that's 9 months. And
Right.
so I think that has to change your perspective on saying I just want to cash. I think that's a huge point that you guys made.
Well, I agree with that assessment. One of the things I've noticed for me is when I play online, my ROI is better than when I play live. And part of that is because playing an online tournament is nothing special. I can play, I can get up, if I bust out, I don't have to drive home. I can sign up for another one. I might be playing 2 or 3 at the same time. So busting out is no big deal. So there I am very comfortable using an aggressive stance when I think it's the appropriate thing to do. And I don't worry about busting out. And my ROI shows that. I win a lot more and my return is better. In live tournaments, I have to remind myself to do the right thing. If I just make it to the final table, if I'm playing a $100 tournament and I get my $100 back, that is not going to make a big difference in my life. It's not going to make a big difference in my bankroll. But if I get $1,200 back, now all of a sudden we're talking about something. So I'm much better off trying to play more aggressively. The trick is, of course, then learning when to do it and when not to do it, so you don't just bust out willy-nilly.
And without getting too far off the rails, like psychologically speaking, I think it's what we're describing. I think a little bit is this sense, like you said, when you're playing online, John, like you bust out, you click the X button, you're out. But live, you're like, there is that sense of like, I got to stand up and walk out of the room now. Like I'm the guy that made that dumb play or something. And
yep.
I
the
don't
walk
know
of shame.
Thank you. The walk of shame. Like there's maybe a little bit, of that in play too, which I would assume for some people can kind of come up some, but there is a little bit of that, like between driving there and like all the effort that it takes sometimes. Again, when you're not doing that on like a 5-6 days a week basis, that kind of comes into play too. As much as all of us probably wouldn't want to admit it, it's like that happens. We all know that, but when it happens, when you're in the moment, your face gets a little red. You're just not.
Well, that also goes into play. That also goes into play with, making the right play. Sometimes in a vacuum, the right play looks really stupid if it doesn't work out, but over time, it still may have been the right play. So having the confidence to do that is a huge deal. Now, it takes a lot of experience, maybe more than I have, to do that. But, you need to be able to make that aggressive play, even if you'll look stupid if you get called or if it doesn't happen to work out this time. Over the course of that situation, thousands of times, if it's the right play, it's the right play.
Well, to say, I think that just goes back to you just have to embrace variance. It just, I don't want to. I hate it. I hate you, variance. But I think you have to embrace it because that's like, I think someone said earlier, like they get so pissed at someone that would call them off with just a terrible hand and suck out them. It's like, but that's what you wanted. That's what you want that to happen over and over again because you're going to win when that happens in the long run. But those times when it doesn't, you're like driving home, you're like, guy in the blue hat, I hate you.
Well, I mean, if there were no variants, this game would be chess. And how many casinos do you know that have grown up around people playing chess
Zero.
against each other?
No, that's right. And I think that's the big transition that I think a lot of rec players have to make, and I'm still working on making it, is that transition from being results oriented to decision making oriented. And I think a lot of us struggle with that because it's exactly your point. We go home beating ourselves up for getting queens in against jacks and losing. And I'm like, well, that's crazy. But if it holds up, you're gonna rake in a nice pot. And I think that's kind of what we do, right? We shove a big flush draw, and if it gets there, we just think, well, it should get there, and we just kind of move on with our day and stack our chips. If it doesn't get there, we second guess it. And so I guess the question is, like what John's saying, is it the right decision? I mean, that's how I just busted the last tournament. Massive pot. I had squadoosh. I had nothing, but the board became really scary, and I decided to shove, what I had left. And of course, I got snap called by like the nut flush, and I was out. And people are looking at me like, "Oh, what an idiot!" And it maybe was an idiotic play. I don't know, but I would probably do the same thing in that spot with my same stack with that size of pot, in the middle, and I bet I'm going to win that pot 60% of the time or more. But you look at it and you say, well, geez, I'm such an idiot player. But if that works, you feel like a genius. So which is it? Is it just the result that determined if you're a genius or an idiot, or is it the decision?
Well, I think it's the decision, definitely. As long as you went through the process in your mind of what the connotations of that move was and what you put your opponent on and what type of opponent he was. Could he fold in that spot with this, that, or the other thing? So all of those things come into play. So I'm with you, Steve. I think it's more of a process thing than a results thing. I think there's many times where I busted out of a tournament and I'm going home and I'm going over in my head how I played this hand or that hand. And there might be one or two hands that I kind of question what I did, but for the most part, I can look back and say that, yeah, I made good decisions most of the time. And when I went out, the hand I went out on, I made a good decision. And so the process was there. It just didn't get the results.
For me, very few of my regrets when I look back on a tournament were because of a play I made. It was because of a play that I really felt was the right play, but didn't have the guts to follow through on.
That you didn't make, right?
Yep. Exactly. Oh, yeah, exactly. There were in a tournament I was just playing the other day, there was a spot where I knew there was one particular person who was really telegraphing their hand with their bets. They'd come in, if they liked their hand, they'd bet anywhere from 4 to 6x to open the pot. And if they didn't, they'd limp. And it was late in the tournament. They had overwhelmingly huge chip stack. But I kept thinking, it got to me, and I was going like, I should just raise all in. I know they'll fold. And then, 2 possessions later, I wimp out. Someone else does the exact same thing and takes down the pot. Now, it could be that other person had a hand that would have called my all in, but I still think it was the right play for that situation. But I didn't do it.
Yeah. I love that. That's a great soundbite for the podcast too. I love how you said that.
Well, it's tough too. I mean, John, I totally know what you're saying because you feel like you recognize the spot, but it kind of comes back to all this kind of stuff with record or whatnot. And I actually wrote down what I thought was a really interesting quote that I want to look up because it's kind of summarizes to me, if you guys don't mind. But I kind of took this quote from an author about someone who does kind of mental coaching and things. But I feel like it kind of summarizes what we're describing as, we're not professional players yet, but I think it's kind of what you're just describing, John. And if I could read this quote to you guys, you see what you think. I was going to see what you guys thought of this, but it's from a guy named Dennis Waitley, if I'm properly pronouncing his name. But it said, "It's not what you are that holds you back; it's what you think you are not." And I thought that was it definitely wasn't written from a poker perspective, but kind of what you were just describing, John. It's like you see these spots, you you should fire on it, but it's the thing that's holding you back isn't firing and being like, darn, I was wrong. The guy snapped me off and has a nut. It's those moments that we all kind of recognize. It's not those ones where we go, I was ambitious and I took a shot and I was wrong. Usually when I drive home and I'm like that, I'm not mad at myself. Like I took a shot. It's like you said, it's the ones where you're like, you have those two spots. You remember that the one in your mind where you're like, I should have fired there, but I didn't. It's kind of the what you didn't fire and it's what you aren't that kind of like holds you back still. And I think, getting back to the book a bit and how aggressive Jonathan is and what he's sort of describing is sort of taking a bit away from what you are or what you aren't and just saying, here is a very like set sort of procedure or process. And if you follow this and just do it, just not to say you're like a robot, but just go out and autoplay these kind of things and take out your emotion. And I want to last 3 hours today because I haven't got to play in a long time, all that kind of stuff. I think that kind of what he's describing really will lead to being a winning, profitable player over time. But I totally 1,000,000% understand why that can be difficult.
Yeah, I love that quote. That's fantastic. It reminds me there's a Mandela quote that's kind of like that as well. We're more afraid of what we could be versus what we are now. Well, let me switch gears a little bit. There, Chris Gordon had put a question out here about Jonathan Little. Had said something like, tricking my opponents into bluffing at me might be the most profitable thing that I do at the poker table. And Chris had asked the group, do we do this? And if so, how do we do this?
I've been trying to do it more. And how I do it is you underrepresent your hand. If you originally when I started playing, I would play aggressive and always follow through with that aggression. So, I have a flop. I might bet for 3 streets with ace king and nothing hits, just hoping people will fold. And because if you don't fold, you're going to look weak and then they're going to take the pot away from you. But then you have to remember, this game is not about winning pots. It's about winning chips. And part of winning chips is not losing them. So I've then toned down my aggression and realized one of the easiest ways to do it, particularly if you're against an aggressive player, is maybe do your continuation bet, check the turn, and then call any river, because that gives them a chance to try to win the pot, take it away from you. I mean, you have to decide when you're going to do this, and it depends upon how wet the board is on whether or not you want to give a free card on the turn. But that's a good way to let them bluff into you.
Yeah, I totally agree. To me, that's the absolute number one way that I'm aware of. It's pot control, but it is something what you said a few weeks ago too, John, about checking for value. It's kind of that same thing. You're not checking because you're scared. You're actually checking because you think this is how you can actually maximize the amount of chips you're going to win in the pot. Because if you if you continuation bet and then you bet the turn again, he's only going to continue with a big draw or a decent sized hand, and you're going to get folds from all of those inferior hands. So why not check, take a little bit of risk that you get outdrawn, and then you're probably going to get some value on the river.
Yep. And another way to accomplish it too can be as simple as just being in position against an aggressive player who has the lead in the hand, and then just let him keep the lead. then they'll do what I used to do, fire 3 barrels at it, and you can win the pot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even top
John,
pair.
I agree with you, John and Steve. Like, that was my number one note from chapter 9, is keeping hyper aware of what you're inducing. So, like, I think, Jonathan, if I quoted this right on the sheet, it was, by showing weakness or when you have a good but not great holding, checking back the turn and with the intention of calling down like river bets or giving the illusion of having fold equity. I mean, I think he rolls through a bunch of scenarios that I think previously, before reading this, I really thought, like, I have to keep the hammer down. And it really makes sense how you actually make a lot more value, or you can gain a lot more chips, I guess, and get a lot more value out of your hands by as aggressive as Jonathan described being. It's funny because in the long run, what I got the most out of this book, and in particular this chapter kind of hammers it home, is the power of sort of pot controlling. I think we were talking about pot controlling, but probably the most of anything that we've discussed through this discussion. And it's funny because that doesn't sound like an aggressive move, pot controlling. It sounds like a sort of a weak move. But in that particular chapter, it really hammered home just that idea of, because you can induce people to do things or give the illusion of fold equity when you've got something where you're going to snap people off on the river, where I think most people think like, well, yeah, I got to fire again here, And so I agree with you, John. I think that, and Steve, I think you guys both mentioned that. It's an interesting concept from a player that I already knew before reading this book of his, having had read some more of his, how hyper aggressive he is. That is more of a pre-flop hand range scenario of how he plays. But after that, how much he pot controls and how important that is in a multi-table tournament in the long run, especially extrapolated over many tournaments. So,
well, the other side effect that gives you is it gives you balance, because now even when you have it, you aren't necessarily making the aggressive player doing the aggressive move. So now, when you check, it doesn't mean you don't have it. And when you bet, it doesn't mean you do have it. So no one can read from your actions exactly what that means, which helps keep your range wider and gives your opponents a harder time on playing correctly against you.
Yeah, you'll see your opponent slow down once you've done that. I think about my situation. I feel like I get floated a lot, and I don't know if I just feel that way, if everybody else is, but I feel like people float me a lot. Which means if I'm out of position, I raise pre-flop, I get called by somebody in position, and I think people are just floating me because they know I'm pretty aggressive, and so then I continuation bet and they call, and then I check the turn and they almost always bet, and I will fold from time to time because I don't have it. But if I implement something like this, where I actually have top pair or something I feel comfortable with, that just calling, I will take that same line where I bet the flop, I get called, I check the turn, and then I call both the turn and the river bets, and it shows down, and I have the best hand. And kind of to your point, John, it balances my range, but another indirect impact of that is it does slow down your opponents, because then, like you said, if I check the turn, they have to at least think, is he checking to induce, or is he checking to, because he missed or has a draw or something like that. So I think it does create that other dynamic where people start going, even if they're not consciously, some of the tournaments we play in, they might not consciously be putting together that a play, was being made on them and how we're doing things.
Exactly.
But I do think it creates a subconscious sort of perspective of, ooh, that guy kind of scares me. And there's so much value in that.
At a minimum, they know that you're not, that just because you check doesn't mean that you are going to fold.
That I've given up. Exactly. I might be inducing you, and that later becomes, next time they get that exact same scenario, do they go, oh boy, am I walking into a trap here? Versus if you're playing someone that checks folds every time, it's like freebie. It's like, here you go, they'll fold. It's like, you don't even think about it anymore. But you, like you said, Steve, at least in the tournaments we play, you only have to do that like once. It's not at probably Jonathan's level where like you have to do this tournament over tournament to kind of drill this into people's heads. You do it once or twice, and people are like, I'm just going to check back.
Yeah, and like I said, some people don't even really know what's happening to them. They just know you're either tricky or you scare them a little bit. And that's enough to get you a walk from time to time, or some free river cards or whatever, just that they're a little bit scared that you're not predictable. So what else stands out from chapter 9? Anything else kind of stands out? That was sort of the miscellaneous topics chapter.
It was such a cool chapter because it was like random in the middle. I don't know if it's the middle of the book, but however far through the book, just dump a bunch of like, here's some really good things I thought of at one point. But it seemed to fit because then he moved sort of through all the blinds. But I had wrote down just a couple things or whatever that if you guys mind going
go
through.
For it.
Well, I guess I usually kind of write down. As I read through the book, I always broke things down into two things. I always broke them into like, yeah, that's a really good reminder. That's the thing that's kind of a basic thing you should always kind of keep going back through. And then I would write down on a separate list like, I've never really kind of considered that before. And in this one, there was just I think we've talked about a few, but and I really thought, even though we barely talked about it, but that giving the illusion of fold equity. So I think is really concrete example of like calling min raises with hands that, have huge implied odds is extremely, extremely profitable because people tend to, when they have their monsters, they'll min raise them because they're trying to get value out of it, especially I would say at like rec poker level. And you very well might stack people when you hit those, just, when you flop 2 pair or better. And I also thought it was just an interesting thing to kind of keep in mind that making big calls when you're playing very loose aggressive is kind of the way to go, because he talked about the debate between making big calls and making big folds. And I think he said, you have to make big calls when you're playing loose, which makes sense because people put you on such a wide range and you have no idea. And then making big folds when you're playing tight aggressive is kind of important to that style. So those are a couple takeaways that I just kind of written down from chapter 9.
Yeah, that's good. And that's sort of that subcategory of just kind of knowing how other people perceive you. It's huge.
Yeah, I think you brought up the give the illusion of fold equity, and I thought that was pretty eye-opening for me because he talks about the size of the pot when you get to the river and sizing your bets to make it look like you could fold to an all-in because of the pot size or your stack size. And those are things that I end up at the river and I'm looking down, I'm going, hey, wait a minute, I only got half a pot bet in front of me here. What happened? I don't really pay attention to that a lot of times, and I get into those spots. And so he talked a lot about your bets going in on the flop and the turn and sizing them such that you have that pot size bet on the river or whatever. So I thought that was really eye-opening there to something to really pay attention to that I've always ignored in the past.
I agree. That happens to me too. I get myopic and like you were heads up in a pot. Like I'm just trying to win the pot. I'm not, and then all of a sudden, like you said, I'm like, shit, now I've got like a third of a pot bet on the end. They're going to snap me off with this. How did I get here? Being conscious of that bet sizing is because I was just strictly thinking, like, I'm so focused in on like the bet size, bet size of what I'm doing right in that moment. Cause I'm like fold or whatever, all those intentions you're going through. I agree with you. I get into that spot myself a little, and Jonathan does a great job of like think of that ahead. It's all a part of this book is just think of those streets ahead and leave yourself with spots. And I think when we get into those other chapters, he talks specifically how to play, 20, 30 blinds, like kind of the betting 4th and 8th, and those blinds. I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but I agree with you. That's happened to me, and I'm sure all of us before. We're like, well, I don't have any fold equity now. What am I doing?
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's one of those things too when you talk about being able to think ahead, including, okay, if my goal here with the hand that I have is to get my entire stack in by the river, ideally you start thinking, okay, well, if I go, 7 bigs here and 15 on the turn, and then I got 30, or do I need to go, 5, 12, 25, or whatever it is, if you're really able to think through all of that in advance, I think that's fantastic. But to me, it shows the importance then of getting down to heads up as soon as possible, because if you start thinking about what are all the scenarios that could happen, it seems like the more people in the pot, the more scenarios there are, and it just seems like, what's the point of planning? Because it could just be, everybody could fold to it, could just become absolutely chaotic.
Yeah, I think most of the stuff that he talks about, it's your heads up against your opponent. Because most pots, and we know this from just when we play, that it mostly ends up very seldom on the river is there more than 2 people left. It's usually, there might be 3 or 4 on the flop, but they'll weed themselves out pretty quickly, and it'll get down to a heads up situation pretty quick. So
right, but sometimes you see those, the mistakes in bet sizing where you will have 4 people to the flop, and then somebody bets 300 into a pot of 2,500, and everybody calls. Then they bet 400 into the pot of 4,000, and you see that sometimes. And I think in some cases, I think those rec players they have a big hand and they want to keep everybody in. Some cases they don't know, but I think it just shows you. I mean, how can you possibly consider what scenario you're going to be in if you have that many people left in the pot? So I think there's just to the rec players that are out there, I think that the more you can hone that down to heads up, I think the better in terms of being able to think ahead. All right, any other thoughts from chapter 9?
Just one more. He's got a little section on big calls or big folds, and I think Derek mentioned that it's if you're aggressive, you got to lean towards big calls. But I just have a funny little anecdote, because I was playing Jonathan Little style one night at Grand Casino, and it was the deep stack, so we had lots of chips. We were deep stack, so I'm playing it, and I got to the river with garbage, and I had to show. And I was the pre-flop aggressor, right? I came out raising pre-flop and got 2 or 3 callers. I made my continuation bet. It got to heads up, and I snuck out a pair or something on the river. I had like Jack 8, and there was an 8 on the river, and I won the pot. And so then everybody saw my hand. And so from that moment on, I could not raise a pot without getting 2 or 3 callers. So yeah, making the big calls and the big folds are great, but people are going to find out about you real quick. And then in the tournaments that we play, we may start with deep stacks, but it doesn't take long to get down to that 40 to 27 big blind level, where you don't have the opportunity to do that anymore. And now you got a reputation. It's sometimes it gets tough.
Were you able to adjust your game, or what did you do then once that started happening?
I got real tight after that, and I was able to make a couple of moves, but then I got down short stacked, and then I didn't get any cards. So it was just one of those. That's the beauty of these tournaments that we play, right? They're 20-minute blinds, and within an hour you're down to 25 big blinds.
And I'm going to jump in there just as a way of promoting something we have coming up. So after we're done with the Jonathan Little book discussion, the format is going to become more specific to what are some specific questions people have, and then we'll have some great voices in the poker community reply to that. And one of the first questions we have is a question that a lot of people emailed me, which is kind of what you're getting at right there, which is I seem to be able to build a stack in these tournaments that we play locally, and then the middle of the tournament hits, and I just burn through my stack, and pretty soon I'm playing short stack, and how do we approach that? So just kind of as a precursor to what's coming ahead, that's a question that a lot of us recreational players struggle with, that we're going to see if we can get some of the top dogs to talk a little bit about how do we tackle that, and maybe it's some of it's strategic, some of it's psychological, but how do we overcome that hurdle?
Nice.
I think one of the big things that for me I've always had to do is remember that as the blinds go up, as they represent a larger portion of your stack, the more important it is to play more aggressively. And that's kind of fights the natural inclination, because when you have lots of chips, you're willing to throw a few splash around early on in the tournament. But actually there, you're not winning hardly anything. It doesn't matter how aggressively you play. If you lose a pot, it doesn't matter. But once you start to get short, you cannot afford to let yourself get shorter. So you have to be willing to make moves, and you have to be willing to play aggressively at that point. And that's the easiest way, especially in these tournaments. You can start off with a big stack. You can double your stack. Well, then you're not going to be short stacked for 2 hours instead of 1 hour. But you still have to, in the end, continue to grow that stack.
Yeah, and I think like what you're saying is, as you get shorter stack, you welcome more variance because you just have to. And I think one of the tricks that's helped me is I don't really pay attention to average stack like I used to. It's really number of big blinds, but one of the things that's helped me is really having a target, not for necessarily each blind level or anything, but I go into a tournament right now and I know roughly 10% of the people are going to get paid, which means if I start with 10,000 chips, when we're in the money, the average stack is 100,000 chips. So I look at that and I said, that's really kind of my target. Is I'm aiming for 100,000 chips at least by the time we get in the money. And I think, we get this. What happens is, as the people bust out, it becomes a more and more of an impact as you get closer to the money in terms of the average stack. If you're worried about that, so we sit there with 25 or 30,000 chips and we've tripled up, and we think, man, we're in good shape. And we're getting close to the money, but the reality is we really need to triple up again to be a contender for the title. And so I tend to not look at, I got 30,000 chips and not get too excited about it. I think, oh, that's a nice start, but I've got a long way to go to get to where I want to be by the time we're even in the money, not much less, looking at winning the tournament. So that's helped me a little bit and helps me keep my foot on the pedal a little bit. Okay, other thoughts from Chapter 9?
The only other thing I had was that he recommended you play straightforwardly in big pots. And I kind of liked that idea because obviously when it's a big pot, it's representing a larger percentage of your stack. So you don't want to make any risky plays because you have a chance of losing a large percentage of your stack. And if it's a large pot to the other player, they are less likely to put money in bad. Meaning, if they're calling you, they've got it. So, play a little more straightforwardly, maybe make smaller bet sizes if you're going to try to steal, because they're going to still have a harder time calling because the pot is so large. And that's something I don't always remember to do.
Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks once again to Rob and to Andy and to Derek and to John for providing their input, as well as Jonathan Little. Having a great time learning the game and learning with these guys that are a great group of guys. So appreciate that. Next week, we will finish this book club with part 5, where we start talking about some things related to non-deep stack. As our stack starts shrinking, what are some things that we can do? How do we adjust our playing style? And then after that, we're going to get into some questions that have been submitted by you, the audience, and we're going to pick the brains of some of the world's best players on how they approach those things. The first topic I think we're going to do will probably be related to, as you have a shrinking stack, as you near the bubble, why is it so often we struggle with that sort of play as we get toward the later stages, as we get toward the bubble? We might have a decent stack and all of a sudden it's gone. How much aggression should we play with? How much should we keep our foot on the pedal? All of those sorts of questions we're hopefully going to address with our experts in a couple of weeks. So thanks for joining us. If you have any suggestions, please let me know. If you have any interest in helping us promote what we're doing, please feel free to do the retweet thing or to send the link out to folks. You can find it at runaces.com/recpoker or out on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks much. See ya. Good luck on the felt.